Dr. Hans Blix, thanks for joining us on Foreign Correspondent. Can I start first by asking about the last couple of days? The Bush administration has come out fighting to defend its interpretation of the intelligence material that it used to justify the war in Iraq, to say that there was a clear and present danger concerning Iraq's weapons of mass destruction. Are you now convinced?
Well, a government gets a lot of intelligence from its own authorities, and I'm not privy to what they have received and what basis they have been given for it. I only judge the intelligence that we were given from the US and from the UK and from several other countries. And in that respect, we appreciated that, and it's necessary. It was a one-way traffic. It was not a commerce. We didn't give them something back. It was of use to have. However, I also had to say that when it came to intelligence about sites, it did not lead us to any sites where there were any weapons of mass destruction. We were given many sites, and only in 3 cases did it give us anything at all, but it was not weapons of mass destruction. That shook me a bit, and I also had to say that yes, we hadn't had that great help on the sites.
When you look at the intelligence material, the information that you received from the British and the Americans, were you convinced that Iraq still possessed weapons of mass destruction and that they posed a clear and present danger?
No, you see, we had a more prudent attitude, and I want to have evidence. And of course we were aware that there were lots of things unaccounted for. The Iraqis might have declared that they had so and so many tons of this or that, and then they said that they had destroyed it all in the summer of 1991. Well, if there wasn't evidence that they only produced those tons, they might have produced more. And since there were no inspectors present at the destruction of these things, they might have squirreled something away. So there were large quantities and numbers unaccounted for. That, of course, could mean that they had hidden it somewhere. They could be somewhere, but it was not evidence. And that's why I warned against the idea of jumping to the conclusion that something that is unaccounted for does not exist. That's not certain. That still is to be found out. We cannot exclude it, and the Allied coalition is urging us to have patience. Well, maybe they'll find something. They have not found very much yet, at any rate.
If you look at the interpretation that the Americans took on their intelligence material, we can't exclude the notion that Iraq did have and does have weapons of mass destruction, and that they did pose a clear and present danger. Isn't that true?
No, that's possible. They could have them. And if they assumed that they had them, well, then they could pose a danger, though Iraq as a whole, of course, could not pose the same danger in 2003 as they did in 1991. I mean, the army was a fraction of what they have in the past. No one believed that today they would have any nuclear weapon. So it must have been a much smaller danger than they were in the past.
Enough? If you look at the American interpretation of that material, was it enough to justify a war at this time?
Well, that's really not my task to judge for anybody whether it was enough for them to go to war or not.
Do you believe, or do you fear, that the Americans themselves may have been duped or led astray with intelligence material, perhaps from Iraqi opposition groups?
Well, I think they had much more information from defectors than we did. We did not see very many defectors, and defectors are an important source. And they, in the past occasion, they led UNSCOM to the right track. But it's also a source which all intelligence people know you have to be careful with, because sometimes they want to say more than they actually know. They may want to have asylum, or they may want to be interesting, etc. And I think we were a little more insulated to that than what the governments were.
So you'd have treated with caution, quite a deal of caution, any information that you got from
so.
the
If you take
Iraqi
the example
opposition.
of Mr. Hamza, for instance, I read his book. I was Saddam's bomb maker. I read his book, and from my experience at the IAEA, I can say immediately that a lot of this is wrong.
The British clearly believed that the Iraqis had delivery systems for chemical and biological weapons. In September, the Defence Secretary Donald Rumsfeld, the American Defence Secretary, said that Iraq had weaponized chemical and biological weapons. Do you believe that to be true, based on the intelligence material that we've seen?
Well, they had weaponized these in 1991 when the UN went in. They used the chemical weapons in the war with Iran, and with a great deal of success they had used them because they stopped the human waves there. And they also used them, as we know, against their own people in Halabja, with horrible consequences. So it is true, they had weaponized. They also had weaponized biological weapons. But did they have any of these remaining after the summer of 1991? That's another matter. They claim, the Iraqis claim, they had destroyed it all, except some chemical weapons that they declared they were there, and UNSCOM destroyed these large quantities. But that was largely over by 1994.
What was your belief? Right up until the war started, what was your belief?
Well, you see, I'm not supposed to have a belief. I'm asked, what was your gut feeling? I say, I'm not supposed to have gut feelings about this. I'd like to see evidence. And there was not evidence that they had these weapons of mass destruction. There were lots of things unaccounted for.
So your conclusion was that they might, or they might not have?
Yes, the conclusion was both. They might have them and they might not have them. I did not exclude either of them. It was our job to look for them. It was their job to declare them. And they did not declare any. Now, I would say that at the present time, the longer time passes without anything being found, the more I think one has to consider, if they didn't have anything, why did they behave as they did? Because certainly the behavior was one declaring one thing one day and then changing the next day. They would stop the inspectors from getting in somewhere. I mean, if they didn't have something, we would have thought that the best would be, well, say, come in everywhere, come to our bedroom, go in there, if it's private houses or whatever, come in. But that was not how they behaved. So one has to think then, why did they behave as they did?
That really goes to support the American case, doesn't it? That if Saddam had nothing to hide, had no weapons of mass destruction, he could have opened the doors. Do you believe that the US is right in interpreting his actions as those of a man who has something to hide, and that something was weapons of mass destruction?
Well, if in due course no one finds anything, then that interpretation was wrong. Then you have to find some other reason why they behaved as they did. And there can be several ideas in this regard. I think my favorite speculation or hypothesis would be pride, that they felt these are imposters, these are international inspectors, and we are a proud people. We have had to accept them, but not 1 inch more than the resolutions really require, and hence a very rigid attitude against them.
So you would actually put forward the hypothesis that pride prevented them from opening up their doors rather than a desire to hide weapons of mass destruction?
It's a hypothesis, and it could also be that they had something behind the doors. I'm not at all excluding that, but I'm saying that the longer time goes and we do not find anything, then we also have to think about what could have been another reason than the presence of weapons.
While your inspectors were in Iraq, the US did give you tips as to sites, locations. None of those turned up weapons of mass destruction, and you've been surprised and said you were surprised that was the case. Do you believe the information they gave you was good information, and was it designed to help you?
It certainly was meant on their part to help us. It was not only the US, I don't want to single out any one of them, the US, UK, there were many of them, and we don't want to specify from where did we get, but we got a good many tips as to sites to go to. And we went to many of them, but only in 3 of those cases did we find anything. And in none of these cases was it weapons of mass destruction. In one case it was documents, it was interesting. Another case it was illegally imported Volga engines, and in a third case it was conventional ammunition store. So that shook me a bit, I admit. And that was also a reason why I stated publicly in the Security Council that intelligence had not led us there. This means no negative attitude to intelligence. I think it's necessary, and it's a difficult job they have.
But if their intelligence material, the intelligence tip-offs they gave you, led you to nothing substantial,
right,
does it now make you doubt the value of the intelligence material that they used to justify this war?
I think one will always have to look at it in a critical sense, just as a court will always look at evidence presented to it in a critical mind, and we did that at all times. And of course there was some intelligence which clearly became wrong. You have the famous case of the alleged contract for the purchase of yellow cake for raw uranium, which turned out to be a fake. Well, that was pretty bad, I think. There was also discussion as to whether the aluminum tubes, that they had imported, whether they were meant for centrifuges or they were meant for rockets. That's disputed. And even today, these famous trucks that many experts seem to believe were trucks for the production of germs, that other experts seem to doubt that is the case. I think this is right. One has to examine it critically, because if you are witch hunting, as they were in my country in the Middle Ages, and you are convinced they exist, well, then you find the witches. Well, I would like to have more like a modern independent court to examine how plausible is this.
Can you describe for me now, with full hindsight, your view of the American position and the pressure that they were placing on you in the days and weeks leading up to the war?
Well, I think that they had given up on the hope that inspection would give them clear-cut answers. They had decided in the year 2002 that they would go the multilateral path. They said that President Bush told us that we have their full support, and I think they meant that, and they were helpful in many, many ways, including the intelligence, although it didn't give so much. And I think that they felt that they could not wait for this to play out for years and years. UNSCOM, after all, started in 1991, and so did we at the IAEA, and it went on until 1998. And they didn't want to have that repeated again, and that I understand, nor did we. I was also certainly not geared to carrying on this for years, but I had hoped that we would have a little more time, because the Iraqis were getting frantic at the end and coming up with many suggestions, and the most interesting, I think, would have been to interview the people who took part in the alleged destruction of all chemical and bacteriological weapons in 1991. We did not have time to do that.
What was that like for you in the last couple of weeks, the days leading up to your departure from Iraq, knowing that you had lists of scientists to interview, more documents had been forthcoming, the Iraqis were in a panic to give you more information, and the US was telling you, I'm sorry, you've run out of time. What was that like?
Well, the US didn't tell us that until they really decided to go to war, and the British were advancing a resolution in the Security Council, which I thought was interesting. They suggested first that Saddam should go public and say that, yes, I assure you, there is nothing, and you can come anywhere. But, of course, since they didn't believe what Saddam would say, there'd have to be something more. And what they talked about was so-called benchmarks. They would have to pay down payment of clearing up 5 different things within a relatively short time. And they asked me, what did I think they should, Iraqis should clarify in very short time? And I said, well, it should be something doable. And they came up with 5 things, different things they should do, and 3 of them at any rate were doable. To bring scientists to Larnaca was one, and another one was to clear up everything about the drones, and the third one was to complete the disarmament with the Al-Samud missiles. So these were doable, I think, within 3 weeks or even a month. But there were 2 that would have been more difficult, one related to the VX and the other one to anthrax. If they did not have them, then it would be difficult to clear it up in a couple of weeks' time. However, I mean, this was going on almost to the very end, and I thought that if that had been accepted, well, then maybe, and if the Iraqis had cleared up 3, maybe there would have been more time for inspection. But I think others interpreted that meaning simply an authorization to go to war, and were not willing to go along with the resolution, so it collapsed.
So can you tell me what it was like personally to be trying to beat the Americans in terms of time running out? I'll rephrase that. Can you tell me what it was like personally to see time running out, to see the Americans saying, I'm sorry, time's up, when you knew there was more work to be done, and you obviously believed it could be fruitful?
Well, I think they were skeptical about it all. They were skeptical about interviews. We had a long period in which first the Iraqis said you have to have minders present, or you have to have tape recorders, etc. So they were skeptically viewing the inspection as a means of getting anywhere. They were willing to give it a try. I'm not accusing them of being hypocritical in this. I think they genuinely wanted to give it a try, but not for very long. And you must remember they had about 200,000 people sitting around in the desert, and it's getting warmer. So I think that was a pressure on them.
That was their choice, though, to do that, when you were saying that we haven't finished.
Yes, we had not ordered the 200,000 men to go into the desert, but at the same time, of course, a military presence was something that increased the Iraqi anxiousness. We wouldn't have been in inspection at all if the Americans had not had a military build-up in the summer 2002. I'm not a pacifist, don't misunderstand me, not at all. But I think it's a little like you threaten people with jail if they misbehave. But if they misbehave, you throw them in jail, you have failed. The same thing with military pressure. It may be very useful, but the moment that you have to use it, well, then you have failed. And that's what we did.
Can you describe for me then the sentiments that you were feeling in those last days when you were realising that time really was running out? Was it a sense of frustration, or were you quite resigned to the circumstances?
Well, somewhere in between, I would say. I mean, of course, I would have loved to go on and to find out and to achieve a peaceful solution of this. And I think it would be paradoxical if eventually they find out that there is nothing. They had many other reasons to go to war. We now learn. I mean, the weapons of mass destruction was the one that was projected, and I think it was real, but we hear many other reasons at the moment. Maybe something good will come out of it, but a lot of people have died as well, and a lot of negative things come out as well. I mean, inspection is a very inexpensive way of going about things. It costs like $80 million a year, and what the Americans do in the war perhaps costs $80 billion. So it's much cheaper in terms of money, but also much cheaper in terms of loss of life. Now, on the other hand, the horrible regime is gone, and no one regrets that. It's certainly one of the worst regimes in the world. But the balance is too early to make.
When you look at the time that's been taken now to search for weapons of mass destruction, and they're saying it may take 6 months, do you wish you had that 6 months with your inspectors and had been given that time?
Yes, I would have liked to have a little more time, but I never pleaded for it, because I felt that if I were to plead for it, it would be seen that my premise was one of guaranteeing that I can find something out. And I don't think we were ever in a position to be able to guarantee that we would come out with the truth. But if there isn't anything, if they don't have any weapons of mass destruction, then I think a gradual work, more and more interviews, would have had a chance at any rate to come closer to that truth. Whether it would have been believed by the Americans and others, I don't know, because they were so convinced that the things existed there that if we had come out with a contrary conclusion, I'm not sure they would have believed us.
Deep down, do you believe that weapons of mass destruction were a convenient justification for this war, when really the real reason for it, the true reason, was regime change?
Well, you see, for a long time the Americans talked about regime change, and it's true that if regime is gone, well, then the will to go for these weapons will be gone, and you are safer, at least for some period. There may become someone around later on who will still have the scientists, etc., who could go for it. But it is true that taking out Saddam certainly was an important way of getting rid of the weapons, and that going only for the weapons and leaving him alone, leaving him there where he was perhaps less satisfactory from those who wanted full certainty.
Given your experiences, why do you believe the US was in a rush to war?
Well, they had 200,000 men sitting in the desert. That was one thing. And secondly, I think they fear that if there were to be delays, say of a couple of months, then we would get back to the same kind of situation, that it was ambiguous. That yes, there were some good signs or negative signs. Then you'll ask for another 3 months, and you'll be in the same situation as you were during the 90s. I think that was their fear. I have some understanding for that, though I think that the Iraqis were much, much more cooperative with us in February and March than they ever had been before. I mean, UNSCOM had constant problems with access to sites. We'd never had problems with access to sites. And at the end, they came up with a number of ways in which they tried to demonstrate that there was nothing. They did not do that. They didn't succeed in it, but there was an attitude at the end that was certainly active and could have helped.
And that could have been due to the 200,000 troops sitting just outside the borders?
Yes, I think they were so proud that they would not move very much unless they were under pressure. That is true.
Would there have been a different outcome, do you believe, if your inspectors had found proof of weapons of mass destruction? Could we have averted a war, do you believe?
Well, that's hard to say. I mean, others might have said, well, there you are, they have omitted. They didn't declare this, and hence they are in new breach, and now we go to war. On the other hand, if the world were to see the Iraqis as saying that, well, here we have now found 200 tons of chemical weapons, and we are looking frantically for the biological ones, it would have changed the situation. There would have been a new dynamic, and maybe a war would have been averted. I don't know. We didn't land in that situation.
You can't predict what would have happened?
No.
Last few questions. What would you say about those allies, Britain and Australia, who followed the US line that weapons of mass destruction did pose a clear and present danger? We're now looking with full hindsight at the fact that we haven't found anything conclusive now.
Well, I didn't have so many opportunities to meet with the Australian government discussing it, but I did talk to Tony Blair several times, and I'm quite sure that he was personally convinced, and it was sincere. He was not just a subterfuge. He was genuinely convinced about the weapons, and he was also completely convinced, as I was, about the evil nature of the regime. But I think that the evidence that they had and that we took part in was not sufficient. They might have had other evidence, which I'm not privy, and that they will have to discuss with their parliaments about, not with me.
The US and its allies are now sending in a team of 1,300 more personnel to search for weapons of mass destruction. Have they asked your office for help, for access to all the data that you've accumulated?
No, it seems to me a little late in the day. That's the only thing that surprises me, that they are now, 2.5 months after, sending in people to look for what was really the reason for the war. But there have been people before there, and we have heard some of the names. These are competent people. I have no reason to doubt their integrity. They didn't find anything, nor did we. However, I think that any outside independent verification would have greater credibility.
Why do you think the US is refusing to allow back in your inspectors?
Well, they are in charge of the whole thing. And if they are in charge of the occupation of the country, why shouldn't they be in charge of looking for the weapons as well? Moreover, there are security situations. The country is not secure yet, and international civilian inspectors would need to operate in a secure environment. We can hardly move around surrounded by American or British troops to protect us. So I'm not at all surprised that they say that they are in charge and they run it.
Has it surprised you that they've not contacted your office or asked for any of the information that you've accumulated?
Well, we have had some information they've asked for about a site that they were interested in, and we saw no particular reason why we shouldn't give that, so we did give it to them.
Would you have expected them to perhaps cooperate and to liaise with you to a far greater extent? I mean, you guys went in, you found what you found. You certainly had access to scientists. You must have accumulated a wealth of information. Why hasn't that been asked for? Why hasn't it been passed on?
I think they feel that they've taken over.
There's no need for you any longer?
There might be later on. The Security Council has said that they will revisit the mandate of UNMOVIC and of the IEA, and we'll see. When things have calmed down a bit, maybe they will.
Do you suspect that the inspectors would be allowed back in once you go? That perhaps you're the barrier to the US allowing inspectors back into Iraq?
I'm not so sure. I think it's been said on the American side that it's nothing personal. They were disappointed that at the time when they needed 6 votes in the Security Council, that we did not come out and say that the Iraqis are violating their obligations. We didn't have a reason to do that, and I think the more time passes without anybody finding it, I think we are being sustained in that. But they were disappointed at the time, and I understand that was a political disappointment. I think it's more a question of the organization, of the independence of the UN inspectors, rather than anything personal. I've had good personal relations with the US.
Do you think perhaps your crime, though, in the eyes of the US, was that you were too independent? You didn't do enough of what the US wanted you to do?
Yes, and yes. But this was part in the mandate that we set up. You see, UNSCOM, the preceding organization, was not as independent. They had all their staff came as gratis personnel from various countries, mainly Western countries. And they had their information from there, they had lots of resources from there, and they had a very close relation with intelligence where there was a two-way traffic of it. Now, I said from the beginning that this was not to be so, and I acted in accordance with the resolution. The US, the UK, everybody else wanted the new organization to be independent. So it was not my personal choice. I wouldn't have gone to one that was dependent, but it was not my choice. I accepted it because it was to be an independent inspection, and that's what we lived up to.
What do you now hope will happen in the search for weapons of mass destruction in Iraq?
Well, I can't say I hope they find something. If there is something, I would wish them to find it. But it's not that I'm longing to find it. I mean, it's plausible that there is nothing. So I hope that my hope would be that truth will come out, that we'll have something convincing. And I'm sure that's what the Americans and the Brits want too.
And do you still believe that UN inspectors must go in at some stage to verify whatever it is the US finds?
Well, if they find 200 tons of mustard gas and a big sample of various biological weapons and put it on the table, that could be incontrovertible evidence, fine. But if they find ambiguous things like the trucks that you now have, or they're talking about the aluminum tubes, etc., then I think that the credibility would be much greater if they had international expertise, not selected by them, but selected by an impartial organization.
What is now going to happen to UNMOVIC, and who is likely to be your successor?
Well, there's plenty to do so far in collecting the material that we gathered during the 3.5 months that we were there. And the files have to be up to date. We have to be spick and span, ready to go in if the Security Council so decides. We also need, I think, to try to digest and compile the experience that we have had, because the UN may yet go for inspection in the future. So this has to happen in the next months, and then we'll see if the Council decides upon using UNMOVIC again. As to my successor, I hope that that's in the hands of the Secretary General, and I'm sure that he will arrange for that within short.
It's only a matter of weeks now before you leave this position. What do you plan to do on your retirement? Are you leaving all of this behind?
Well, first of all, I long to go to my little cottage in the Baltic on island, do some swimming, picking mushroom, berries, and see my family, be together with my wife again. But I have lots of speaking engagements, television, and I also hope to write, lecture. So I think I will have my hands fairly full for the future.
Will you be glad to see this chapter closed?
Yes, I think 3 years is enough. I had intended to stay perhaps a year and a half. That's what I thought it would take, and it was 3 years. But once I came to Vienna for 4 years, and I stayed for 16, so I have not been very good at predicting it. But of course, it would have been even nicer if we had come to a conclusion of the Iraqi affair, which without the use of armed force and a lot of destruction and lives lost. That would have been a much better feeling.
Dr. Blix, thanks for joining us. It happened